What's up, guys? This is Jeff and David Lindsey of the Lindsey Way. Today we're going to talk a little bit about shot placement on the white-tailed deer. We got a little prop here, a little example. We're going to show y'all what we do, what's worked for us in the past, and I think the very first thing we need to talk about is the anatomy of the deer. We got a pretty good example here, pretty good prop, a little buck we call Brandon, but this is a shoulder. This is what we call the no-go zone, definitely with archery equipment. And the lungs kind of get tucked back in here, but the lungs extend very far back. A lot of people want to tuck it up here close, and like I say, these lungs are running all the way back here. You got the heart that sits down low, you got the gut, the liver in here, and the guts and the intestine all the way back, and then obviously you get into the ham, and you got the femoral artery that runs all the way down. But with archery equipment, one of our biggest things is to always be looking for a broadside shot. When you're thinking about not only shooting a deer with any weapon, you got to think not only where you're going to enter that deer, but where that arrow, where that bullet, where that sabot is going to exit. So a broadside shot will always get you the perfect entry, the perfect exit. As it starts turning quartering two, or quartering away, you kind of really get risky. So when we first talk about archery equipment, what I always say, and you know, I've been teaching cache a lot, so I've been going over this a lot in the deer stand. We're pulling up the anatomy of deer online and all that, but you gotta stay off this shoulder. You take this leg right here and you run it up, and you don't wanna be anywhere in here, because yes, you may see some guys online who can you know, penetrate the shoulders in the South or in Texas maybe with the broadhead, but on Midwest deer, there's not a bow broadhead combination alive that you are gonna penetrate this shoulder right here. So I always tell cache, come up this leg and come 2 or 3 inches back, and that's where you wanna start. And I like to just aim dead in the middle of a body, and depending on my angle, that may change a little bit, but I always shoot for the lungs. Yes, some people shoot for the heart. I do believe you can get a little risky there, because if you go under the heart or you go in this little area back behind the heart, that is what I would call a dead zone. That's a dead zone for us personally. The deer we've lost over the years, I think we've lost more deer right here behind the heart than anywhere else, because you're not really at that angle, not really getting into the gut or anything like that. But so a shot that's back here, we like to give a deer a minimum of 12 hours, wouldn't you say? I like 12 to 18, depending on the angle.
And depending on time of day you hit it. Most of the time, if it happens to us in the evening, we'll give them till the next day. But one of the key things to me when archery hunting, after you shoot a deer, is to find that arrow. If you can find that arrow, and you can look there, or you can look on the ground, you can look on the arrow and you can see guts. If you think it's got guts or any kind of thing like that, you know where he's hit. I mean, that's a key thing, because what you mentioned before, we do film everything, and so that arrow can give you evidence if you're not filming that might help you determine if you want to go after this deer or not. So if you shoot a deer in the gut, then that's our suggestion. 12 to 18 hours, depending on if it's in the afternoon. Yes, it's lethal. So he's gonna die. It's just that what you don't want to do, you know, everybody uses this phrase, if in doubt, back out. Well, let me tell you, that's really a smart phrase, because what happens is, if you can't find that arrow and you don't know where you hit this deer, give him some time. Don't you agree?
Yeah. Right. I see people arguing on the internet all the time about, hey, what broadhead's best, or this broadhead's trash, that broadhead's trash. You know, any broadhead on the market will kill a deer. Yes, it's all about shot placement. It's about the broadhead that flies good in your bow and your setup. However, with these expandable broadheads now back in here, that deer's not going to go too far. So instead of arguing about broadheads, I think the main thing, more deer get lost over time, in my opinion, of people going in too soon. They're hitting a deer in this region, they think they smoked him right in the boiler room, you know. They're going in looking for that deer. 2 or 3 hours later, they're jumping him up. Those guts have clogged that hole. And at that point, there's going to leave no blood, there's going to be no trace of which way that animal's going, and he's liable, if pushed or pressured, he's liable to go to 10 buck too. But that shot right there, they're typically going to go between 100 and 150 yards and bed down.
And then another thing too that you were talking about when you were talking about, you know, aiming for the center of the deer right here, is depending on where that deer's at. I mean, that's a great quartering away shot with archery equipment. This shot right here, quartering 2, can be a little risky. Now, I think your odds are a lot better on this shot if the deer's close, if he's closer, because you've got a lot better better penetration, plus you can stay off that shoulder. If this leg right here is straight down, you do not want to shoot that deer when this leg is back. Straight down, or if it's in front of him, that's a good shot. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and I do like a quartering away shot. There again, I'm wanting my arrow to end back here kind of behind at the last rib on a quartering, depending on the angle, but I'm wanting it to come through the lungs and stick in that offside shoulder. That can be, I don't want to say a risky shot, that's a very deadly shot. It's probably one of the deadliest shot there is, but it's not going to be something that's going to leave a lot of blood because you're not going to get an exit hole out of this shoulder. I really don't prefer a quartering 2 shot because you got to realize that when they're like this, that you can only, perfect scenario, you're glancing the back end of those lungs if you're extremely lucky, and then it's coming out maybe in his back ham, leaving no blood whatsoever, and you're just not really catching vital organs in that opinion. Another step further, I have learned this the hard way on archery deer. I do not like to shoot a deer with his head down. That being said, most of the time, deer are going to duck with archery equipment. It may be 2 inches, it might be 6 or 8, just depending on how many pounds you're shooting, how far the shot is. If the deer is 40, 45, 50, that's about our limits. But at that point, I'm going to hold about the heart. So if he doesn't drop, I'm going to hit him in the heart. And if he does drop those 3 or 4 inches, I'm still going to hit him in the lungs. But another thing a little further in this discussion is shooting a deer with his head down versus head up. If a deer's feeding, or I'm gonna wait on him to stick his head up. I'm not necessarily gonna say, back, get him to look his head up and get on alert. That way he has a chance of dropping. But I have learned the hard way, if a deer is feeding with his head down, when that bow goes off, and especially if you're in a ground blind or an elevated blind, something that'll magnify that noise, that deer's head is gonna act like a pendulum, and he's gonna come up and that back end is gonna fall so much quicker, and that's gonna send your arrow a lot higher than you intended it to be in. And that doesn't matter if that's 20, 25, 30 yards. I had an instance earlier this year where I shot a deer in Georgia 3 steps from the base of my tree, and I was up about 20 foot. We're typically 20 to 25 foot. And like I said earlier, because of the elevated blinds or the elevated tree stands we're hunting, there's really no dead zone. You just got to be underneath this spine. When you're shooting at that elevated position and you're shooting a deer directly under you, I was almost exactly down, and I knew my bow was going to shoot high. I've heard a lot of people say, put your 40-yard pin on it, put your 50-yard pin. You just gotta kind of practice those own scenarios in your backyard. Typically me, I'm just putting it down here, knowing that arrow is gonna rise 2 or 3 inches. They're not gonna duck or move a lot, in my opinion, that close, but you're still gonna have that angle you have to compensate for.
Right, yeah. So we've kind of covered pretty much everything about archery equipment. One thing I would like to add though, is that a lot of times, especially if a deer's coming into a food plot or something, you have I don't want to say you have all the time in the world, but if the wind is right and the deer's relaxed, the most important thing I'd say, take your time.
Yeah.
Take your time, practice just like you do at that target. Just slow it down enough that you can concentrate on what you're doing. It's real easy to get excited. Range that deer with your range finder and put that pin on it just like you've been practicing.
Yeah.
So we pretty much covered everything with archery equipment. Let's talk about firearms. Let's discuss about what all the different options that might have more with firearms than we do with archery equipment. Maybe a little more to give or forgive in areas or something like that.
I think if you look up to the next step up, maybe, a rifle. 243 is about the lowest that I've been involved in because my son Cash shoots a 243. I'm shooting a 6.5, a 30-06.
They really need to check their game laws for the state they're hunting in.
Yeah, everywhere is a little bit different. I do think you can get away with a little more on a quarter and 2 shot. I'm teaching Cash with an archery, come up the leg, back it up a couple inches. With a firearm, I'm just saying come up the leg, middle of the body, just tuck it in that crease. If you come over this way, you're still gonna get in that lungs region that's hid behind that scapula there. Same thing applies like archery. You hit him back, it's not gonna probably take them 12 to 18 hours to die, but I still, anything back with a firearm, I'm wanting to give that deer a minimum of 6 hours.
So you still want him to be broadside ideally, but
best case scenario.
Can we give a little bit this way or a little bit
I think if you start talking about that, you can definitely give away, because when we talked about earlier, you're probably not going to have a exit hole to track blood with archery equipment. That changes on firearm. You're probably going to have an entry and an exit hole, sometimes even if you go through both shoulders, depending on what firearm caliber you're shooting.
Yeah, the same thing can apply with a muzzleloader, but I will warn you that shooting a deer with a muzzleloader and a rifle in this area right here can be bad. That's kind of a dead zone for sure.
Anywhere in here, if you hit a deer up here with a rifle, it's usually going to have enough speed, enough shock wave to drop the deer instantly. A possible follow-up shot will be needed. But With a muzzleloader, if you hit that deer anywhere in the spine or the high shoulder and he drops, with a muzzleloader, we have a rule, you immediately reload, because that's what we've called a spine tingler. And with a muzzleloader, more so, a lot more than a rifle, we have seen deer after deer after deer drop. And what do? They get up. And if that deer with a muzzleloader hits the ground and gets back up, you have temporarily paralyzed that deer 99% of the time, and he is gone for good. Now, some of the modern muzzleloaders are a little faster. They're getting more of the rifle speeds, but typically your common muzzleloader that you go to your local firearm store and buy, if that deer drops, you have got to do a follow-up shot, in my opinion.
What do you think about a neck shot? How do you feel about that?
I believe, obviously, with a firearm, anytime you get in front of about middle of the shoulder, anywhere up in here, that is an extremely risky shot, because you have no room for error. Of course, yeah, you can hit the deer in the neck, you can hit the deer somewhere in the high shoulder and drop him. You miss by an inch or two, wind drift, deer moves, that's too much of a chance. That's too risky. We have too much respect for these animals, in my opinion, to take that shot.
Especially somebody getting you into the archery equipment or firearms. I mean, you know, you just don't want to take a chance. You got to have respect for these animals. You got to appreciate it, and you just want to do whatever you can for it to die as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and you got to know your range, whether you're shooting a compound bow, traditional, recurve, muzzleloader, firearm. Go to the range, learn your effective range, and I would never take a shot in the field on an animal that I haven't practiced in my backyard or in the firing range. That's just something that we don't do, and we tell all our buddies,
one thing that we always do is we always check our equipment before we go out. I'm not saying we shoot it every single time, but if any possible way that it could have got moved or damaged or anything, here you was out here yesterday with that crossbow, shooting it with cash before you took cash on him. And I mean, it's just the right thing to do. All right, so we've thrown a lot of stuff out there for everybody.
A lot of information.
A lot of information here. It's all good stuff and all. So what's your best way to close this thing out for a recommendation to everyone watching this?
Be safe, always wear your safety harness, know your equipment, know your shot, respect the animal, respect the game. And for more tips like this, make sure you're following the Mossy Oak Go app, Mossy Oak YouTube page, Mossy Oak University. You guys stay safe out there.